In this video, I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the major events in the history of autism so far. I really love to study the history of different areas of science, autism included, because it's vital to understand the historical context and the human factors in how a science has formed over time. Hopefully you'll find this kind of stuff as interesting as I do. Now, I do want to give a disclaimer that this list is not all-inclusive, and there may be some bias in the events that I've chosen to talk about. So if you feel I've missed something major, feel free to give a shout out in the comments section or even post a video response. The more the merrier. Okay, with that being said, autism is of course probably as old as humanity itself. But it wasn't formally recognized until around the middle of the 20th century. Before that point in history, the word autism was actually used to describe the symptoms of withdrawal into self that are sometimes seen in schizophrenia. The Swiss psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler was the first to coin the term in 1908 and used it in his book Dementia Praecox, which was the original name for schizophrenia. And of course, there's a very muddied history between childhood schizophrenia and autism, and in fact, a lot of kids diagnosed with schizophrenia were probably actually on the autism spectrum and not truly schizophrenic at all. Now, let's fast forward a bit to another key figure in the history of autism, Leo Kanner. Dr. Kanner was an Austrian-born Jewish physician who emigrated to America and set up the first child psychiatry clinic in the U.S. at Johns Hopkins University. He was also the first person to use the word autism in its modern sense. He published his famous case series paper in 1943 called Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact. And I will mention that if you're ever interested in reading the original paper, just go to Google Scholar, type in the title, and you should be able to find a number of websites that host full PDF copies. Just click on those PDF hyperlinks and you should find it. Now, Kanner focused on 11 children, 8 boys and 3 girls. He felt that although they had challenges in communicating and displayed that social withdrawal that inspired Kanner to use the term autism in the first place, he also felt that the kids had good cognitive potential and that they tended to have excellent memory. He also noted that the families of these children tended to be highly intelligent, although there may have been some ascertainment bias there, since well-educated families of higher socioeconomic status were better able to seek help from Kanner in the first place, especially for such a newly recognized condition. Now, just a year later, in 1944, Hans Asperger, an Austrian physician, published his own manuscript called Autistic Psychopathy in Childhood, based on his work with his own autistic patients. Now, I fully recognize that Asperger is a shunned personality as a result of the recent recognition of his roles in the Nazi party and in the extermination of a number of his patients during World War II. So I do completely understand why we don't talk about him much nowadays, given the atrocities that he took part in. However, I am a firm believer that we can't forget our history either, and that we need to keep talking about this guy so that his actions aren't effectively whitewashed simply because he's been forgotten entirely by a younger generation. And in that vein, I highly recommend reading the book Asperger's Children: The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna if you want to learn more about what he did. So Asperger published his paper a year after Kanner. Neither of these guys knew each other, and they were, of course, working half a world away from each other and on opposite sides of the war. But in spite of all this, they both decided to use the root word autism. While Asperger's patients didn't have as many language challenges as Kanner's kids and also weren't quite as socially withdrawn, they did have challenges in social interaction and some oddities of language. They also tended to have obsessive interests, and Asperger also described them as being quite clumsy. Like Kanner, he also noted that they often had excellent memory skills. Now, if you're ever interested in reading an English translation of Asperger's manuscript, Dr. Uta Frith translated it, and it's available in book form. Now, let's move on to the refrigerator mother theory of autism. If you've never heard of it, this came from a very dark time in autism research when the parents, and particularly the mother, were blamed for causing their child's autism. As you can imagine, these ideas were deeply rooted in Freudian theory, which was extraordinarily popular at the time. The history of these ideas gets a little complicated. While Leo Kanner didn't broach the topic in his original paper in 1943, by 1949 he was starting to hypothesize that autism was the result of, as he put it, a genuine lack of maternal warmth. By 1960, he was quoted in a Time magazine interview discussing the parents, and he describes them as just happening to defrost enough to produce a child. Now, we probably all recognize that what Kanner was actually noticing were versions of the broader autism phenotype in parents, but couched in an overly Freudian time in history, there was an incredible amount of emphasis placed on the roles of parents in all types of conditions, including ones like autism. Of course, we all know now that while parents have a huge impact on our mental health, we of course know that traumatic experiences don't cause autism. Instead, those experiences are more likely to lead to things like PTSD and certain personality disorders. Anyways, back to our story. So while Kanner may have been the first widely respected figure to point the finger of blame towards the parents, the idea was actually popularized by Bruno Bettelheim. In 1939, after having been interred in the Dachau and eventually the Buchenwald concentration camps, Jewish-born Bettelheim managed to emigrate to the United States from Vienna. The state of the war meant that he could essentially invent his own credentials. And so rather than having a degree in aesthetics, which is a branch of philosophy and the degree he actually had, suddenly Bettelheim invented for himself a PhD in psychology. Because of the war, there was no way to check his credentials, and so he managed to slip under the radar. Unfortunately, this controversy didn't come to light until after his death, so he basically had his entire career. With these falsified credentials, Bettelheim was hired as a research associate at the Progressive Education Association, which ultimately helped him establish himself professionally. Eventually, in 1944, he became the director for the Orthogenic School for Emotionally Disturbed Children in Chicago, and he held the same position until he retired in 1973. Unfortunately, as with the falsification of his credentials, it was only revealed after his death about how outrageously abusive he was to the patients at the facility. Now, I won't go into detail here, but if you want to read more about it from the patients themselves, I highly recommend looking up the 2018 article, The Horrible Truth About Bruno Bettelheim, Revealed in Letters to the Editor, written by Amy Levitt. Some of the things he's reported to have done are truly disgusting, so I just want to say possible PTSD trigger warning here. While Kanner was the first to suggest that the parent-child relationship played a causative role in autism, Bettelheim solidified the refrigerator mother theory and popularized it in his book, The Empty Fortress, which was published in 1967. Now, ironically, by this point in time, Kanner was moving away from Freudianism and instead became an outspoken opponent to the refrigerator mother theory and Bettelheim in particular. But despite Kanner's 180 turnaround, you can imagine that the damage had already been done, and this theory hung on far longer than it should have. Now, I'm going to bring in another controversial personality, Bernard Rimland. If you've never heard of him, or if you have heard of him, you've probably heard of him because of his association with controversial treatments like chelation or the development of the Dan protocol. Now, in truth, the Dan protocol does actually utilize some interventions that we often use in autism when we have chronic illnesses like Ehlers-Danlos or MCAS. For instance, we may have to change our diets due to food sensitivities. We also often use nutritional supplementation like magnesium or B12 that helps folks like us with chronic illness who are prone to deficiencies. We target the immune system with various MCAS meds and try to reduce inflammation. And while we're not using wacky stuff like chelation or popping ourselves into hyperbaric oxygen chambers, we may benefit from the use of antioxidants because chronic inflammation just loves to stress out our mitochondria and create more reactive oxygen species that damage cells. These are all the major components of the Dan protocol, ironically. But of course, the major difference is that we don't think that using these treatments is going to make us unautistic. Instead, ideally, it's going to improve our health and well-being and hopefully allow us to feel a little less crappy, figuratively and sometimes literally. Okay, with all that being said, you may not be aware that before all that stuff with Dan and chelation, Bernie Rimland wrote a book that actually helped to sound the death knell of Bettelheim's refrigerator mother theory. Rimland was a psychologist as well as a father of a son with autism. In 1964, a few years before Bettelheim published The Empty Fortress, Rimland published his own magnum opus called Infantile Autism, the Syndrome and Its Implications for a Neural Theory of Behavior. You see, as a father, Bernie was certain that he and his wife didn't cause their son's autism. They loved their son to bits, and he was the light of their life. Instead, Rimland was sure that the root of autism was biological. And so what did he do? He read every single paper on autism, a little broader autism phenotype there, right? But he read every paper he could get his hands on. And in the 1960s, before the internet, when if you wanted a journal article, you had to physically go to a university library that carried it and then pay to Xerox a copy of it, you can imagine that that took a lot of time and work. In fact, it took him 5 years to research and write this book. But Bernie searched for all available evidence that autism was rooted in biology, not refrigerator mothers. And he presented his incredibly thorough findings to the world. So while you may have a negative impression of Rimland because of his later associations, just know that he played a massive role in ending the stranglehold that Bettelheim's theory had over autism science and effectively prying us out of the grasp of the Freudians. And that's why Rimland's a major figure in the history of this broad field. Think whatever you want about his later stuff, but we've all benefited from the historical trajectory his book put us on. Okay, I think I'm going to end this video here since this is already getting pretty lengthy. I'm going to continue next time with a part 2, bringing us into the 21st century, where I'm going to talk about changing diagnostics over time, the MMR controversy, and the birth of the neurodiversity movement. So be sure to stay tuned. Thanks again for joining me down this week's rabbit hole. This time it was a historical one. Let me know what you think in the comments. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you next week for part 2. Take care and ciao.